Thank you very much. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers, and we're going to continue the theme of peace and love that was established in member statements. So, the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you to our Chief Yogi and Speaker for that warm message. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Nova Scotians have already done their bit to clean up the environment and meet our emissions target. Starting 10 years ago with the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act, Nova Scotians have paid dearly to reduce our emissions, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, mercury, Mr. Speaker, among other targets. With these strong regulations in place, not only have we met and exceeded the great goals set out at that time, but we've met the targets already that the national government wants us to meet, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Premier, since Nova Scotia has already done its job in meeting its emissions target, why is he imposing an expensive new cap-and-trade system on the province?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for his question. I agree with 100%. Nova Scotians have been doing their part, Mr. Speaker. I think all Nova Scotians know, and we'll continue to work towards continuing to reduce our emissions. The job is never finished. But we wanted to make sure when the national government brought in a price on carbon that the work that had already taken place by ratepayers and all Nova Scotians to ensure that we continue to reduce our GHGs was recognized, and the national government recognized the hard work of Nova Scotians and have allowed us to put in a cap-and-trade system within inside of our province, Mr. Speaker. So the gains that Nova Scotians have already achieved will actually be able to use to smooth out across other sectors, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I agree with the Premier. Of course we can always do more to help the environment clean up emissions. But Nova Scotians' pocketbooks are not bottomless. That's what the Premier is missing, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotia already pays a substantive carbon tax. 15.5 cents excise tax on our gasoline, 10 cents federal excise tax on our gasoline, 15% HST on top of all that, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians are paying a lot, including among the highest power rates in the country. I'd like to ask the Premier if he can tell Nova Scotians today how much more they will pay as a result of his cap-and-trade system.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. That's the very reason we've introduced a Nova Scotia solution to cap-and-trade, Mr. Speaker, was to protect the pocketbooks of Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's not what the CBC and the study they commissioned through St. Mary's University says. Using the federal Trudeau targets of $10 to $50 a tonne on emissions, Mr. Speaker, they have estimated we'll pay another 7 cents on gasoline, another 9 cents on home heating fuel, and I'll table that for the benefit of the Premier, Mr. Speaker. Fact of the matter is, the Premier is trying to tell Nova Scotians they can have their cake and eat it too, that they won't have to pay more, but somehow emissions will magically go down. Well, Nova Scotians have a lot of common sense, Mr. Speaker. They know that that can't possibly be the case. But let's take the Premier at his word that there's no additional cost. Will he share with Nova Scotians? Will he share with Nova Scotians how much in emission reductions he expects will come from his cost-free cap-and-trade system?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Again, I want to tell him that the reason that we brought in a Nova Scotia cap-and-trade is to ensure that we protect the pocketbooks of Nova Scotians, and I also agree with them 100%. Nova Scotians are reasonable, common-sense people. That's why they elected us to run this province and not CBC.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. A mark of effective leadership is the ability to unite. But time and time again, we see this Premier create division. He's tried to set teachers against parents and students, healthcare workers against the people of the province, and now he's trying to make a new enemy, doctors. So I ask the Premier, will he admit that his record of bringing people together is one that could stand improvement?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Again, I want to thank all doctors across this province who continue to work day in and day out to ensure Nova Scotians have access to primary care. Mr. Speaker, they're working in communities across the province to build collaborative care centres to ensure that Nova Scotia have access to primary care from a myriad of primary health care providers. But I want to also be very clear with the Honourable Member that Doctors Nova Scotia, who he's referring to, is an organization that has $4.4 million, Mr. Speaker, that was go towards paying for health, dental, other supports for physicians that the government of Nova Scotia is currently paying for, about $600,000 a month for, Mr. Speaker. We don't believe they should hoard away $4.4 million in their coffers, Mr. Speaker. We believe that money belongs to the people of Nova Scotia, should be used to deliver services. The question for the honourable member, why does he believe taxpayers should give Doctors Nova Scotia $4.4 million?
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
I would say, Mr. Speaker, that the use of the word hoard is a perfect demonstration, as was the use of the word stash earlier this week, of the very inability of the Premier to create unity towards the object of solving the healthcare crisis that I'm speaking about. Doctors are such remarkable people, carrying heavy caseloads, working under heavy pressures, and yet in the midst of it able to demonstrate compassion and care for all their patients. And there's something else that doctors do, is that they talk to one another. So I'd like to ask the Premier, when an out-of-province doctor speaks to a Nova Scotia doctor and asks them, what is it like to work under this government? What does the Premier think they say?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I agree with the honourable member the fact that the doctors are a tremendous group of individuals who are working very hard day in and day out. That's why we believe the $4.4 million of taxpayers' money that is stashed and hoarded away in Doctors Nova Scotia belongs to help them deliver frontline services to Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
A demonstration of the Premier's incapacity to understand the necessity to reach out to groups that one works with is his insistence on using the words stash and hoard now in one sentence, Mr. Speaker. Respect, which is missing in this formulation, is so critical to building consensus, and disrespect, on the other hand, is the fastest way to undermine it. This government disrespected the public sector with Bill 148, disrespected teachers with Bill 75. Now they've disrespected our doctors to the point that Doctors Nova Scotia is taking the government to court. Can the Premier answer the question, how does he think, if he doesn't bring people together, that he can solve the healthcare crisis?
Just before we go to the answer here, I just want to remind the honourable member the previous question, I think, falls under the category of hypothetical. What does the opposite member think about a situation, a perceived situation? So, the Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to thank the honourable member. He alluded to a number of negotiations we've had over a period of time. We continue to support teachers, Mr. Speaker, by replacing the $65 million that his government cut out. We continue to work, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, we continue to work with the hard-working public servants across this province who continue to deliver services to the people of this province. We're going to continue to work with doctors, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we have access to primary health care. But what we're not going to do, Mr. Speaker, is do what that party did when they were in government, was roll over to the unions, Mr. Speaker. It is taxpayers, and every taxpayer needs to be respected by their government, and we're going to do so.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we learned yesterday that the Transcanada Pipeline Corporation has cancelled the Energy East pipeline. This is devastating news to Atlantic Canadians who are counting on that pipeline to be part of this great nation, to be part of creating jobs here, to be part of energy security without having to go to foreign sources, Mr. Speaker. And the reason is very clear. There was no political leadership in Ottawa to make this part of Canada part of the greater country, Mr. Speaker. And Atlantic Canadians are realizing now we have 32 Liberal MPs, silence across the board. So, Mr. Speaker, we're now turning to our Premier. And I'd like to ask the Premier of Nova Scotia, will he stand up and intervene in Ottawa to try and restart this pipeline project?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to assure him I worked with my colleagues here in Atlantic Canada to continue to work with the proponent to ensure that pipeline came to the East Coast. Mr. Speaker, it was my belief that pipeline should have been extended into the Strait, Mr. Speaker, where we already have a transshipment terminal. But the company's made a decision, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to look for opportunities. Yesterday we announced opportunities in renewable energies in the Bay of Fundy. We're going to continue to make sure that people recognize this. Not only is this part of the country a beautiful place to live, Mr. Speaker, it's also a great place to invest, continue to grow good jobs, and an opportunity to live and work with your family.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, those are only just words, and right now, Nova Scotians, they need action. It's one thing to say that these are all great things, but when the Liberal government in Ottawa actually makes it impossible for a private company with its own money to invest in a national pipeline to make Atlantic Canada part of this country, and our federal member of parliament have nothing to say about it, Nova Scotians need the Premier to stand up for them. I appreciate everything he said to us here in this chamber. Will he go to Ottawa and intervene with the Prime Minister of Canada and do all he can to kickstart that project again?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to assure the Honourable Member, Mr. Speaker, that we've continued to put support behind that project. Mr. Speaker, it is our hope, working with our sister province next door, New Brunswick, that we continue to build on that. I want to tell him we're working with Newfoundland and Labrador when it comes to hydroelectricity to work and make sure we have access to a large market in eastern U.S., Mr. Speaker, continue to make sure that we can backfill some of that renewable energy out of this province that will come back into central Canada. Mr. Speaker, I agree 100% with him. I believe the natural resources of this country should be shared across the country. I am as disappointed as he is to see that, but I'm going to tell you, Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to work with all sectors to ensure that the resources of this country are shared with Canadians and also have access to a variety of markets.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, earlier this week, Stella Frida Young, a 92-year-old New Waterford woman in medical distress with a history of heart problems, was transported from Glace Bay Hospital to the Cape Breton Regional by taxi after being told that no ambulances were available. Frida had been discharged from Glace Bay ER in the early hours of Monday morning after tests showed that she had not had a heart attack but began having chest pains and arm pain while waiting outside the hospital for a taxi. Rather than being readmitted to Glace Bay ER, which was closing within the hour for 2 days due to staffing shortages, Frida was told that she could either go home or go to the regional. Mr. Speaker, does the Minister of Health and Wellness believe this is acceptable?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for bringing this the specific situation with that's occurred in Cape Breton to my attention. It's not a situation that I'm familiar with that had been brought to my attention to date, Mr. Speaker, but I'd certainly be looking into the specifics around that and what transpired on that day to get the full details of what did transpire. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, when Frida arrived at the ER via taxi from Glace Bay to the Cape Breton Regional with her son Joe, doctors there found that she had indeed had a heart attack. She was admitted and put in a private room. She has since had a second heart attack. Mr. Speaker, while stories like Frida's break my heart, they don't shock me. Had the mobile care team been active, maybe Frida would have been transported to the regional on Sunday night. To be honest, we're very lucky that Frida's still alive. Although she did say while sitting in the wheelchair, I think I'm going to die here in this wheelchair. I spoke to her son this morning, and they don't know that she will make it. Mr. Speaker, will the minister take responsibility for this disgraceful incident, or does he not see how his decisions and the decisions of this government are impacting patient care?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I assure the member opposite that when individuals across this province have health conditions, whether they be conditions such as cardiac issues, as the member mentioned in this specific case, be they more chronic-based illnesses and issues that individuals may suffer, that indeed the frontline healthcare professionals that assess the patients that come through are fantastic. They do a great job, Mr. Speaker, and I have every confidence that on behalf of all Nova Scotians that those healthcare professionals will provide the best service to all Nova Scotians. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As was just mentioned, the Cape Breton Post is reporting that on October 2nd, a 92-year-old woman with a history of heart attacks was in medical distress, was transported from the Glace Bay Hospital to the Cape Breton Regional Hospital by taxi instead of an ambulance because she was told there were no ambulances available. She had been discharged from the hospital at 4 a.m. and while she was waiting, as stated, she's had chest and arm pains. She couldn't be readmitted because the Glace Bay Hospital was closing. for 2 days. She went from the Waterford, because that emergency room was closed, to Glace Bay that was closing. Mr. Speaker, does the Minister of Health believe it's okay to send a 92-year-old woman with a history of heart attacks who is in medical distress between 2 hospitals in a taxi cab rather than an ambulance?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I'd previously mentioned, this particular situation, circumstances affecting a Nova Scotian, indeed is one that I will be looking into. It's not one that had been previously brought to my attention, but certainly to dig in to see exactly what transpired in that case is important, and I will endeavour to get to the bottom of the details that did transpire on that day. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, this woman was deserving of much better. The Waterford emergency room was closed, the Glace Bay emergency room was closing that morning, and the doctors and nurses who were exhausted and overworked. Mr. Speaker, this is a recipe for disaster. There's a serious lack of physicians and nurses available to cover even the basic emergency room services. They are doing the best they can within a broken system. Will the Minister admit there is a doctor crisis in Cape Breton and that people's lives are being put at risk because of this government's failure to act and address it?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member's question. I assure the member that we continue to remain committed to addressing, providing, and improving primary care access and access to physicians and other primary care providers like nurse practitioners, family practice nurses throughout the province, in Cape Breton, yes, but in other communities across this province as well. We continue to focus on recruitment efforts. This budget that we're debating through the committee, Mr. Speaker, includes investments in commitments to initiatives, new initiatives, Mr. Speaker, that we believe will help us continue down the path of improving primary care services and physician access right across this province, including in Cape Breton. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As everybody is now well aware, the Cole Harbour Eastern Passage constituency that I represent does not have a single family doctor in our constituency. Many families in my constituency are among the 100,000 Nova Scotians without a family doctor, and I get calls about this every week. A 2017 May Liberal campaign promise gave them hope. I'll table the Liberal pamphlet that promised a collaborative health centre for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage. My question to the Minister of Health is, will the Minister commit today to fulfilling the Liberal election campaign promise of a collaborative health centre for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I can assure the member opposite that in our 4-year mandate, I'll endeavour to achieve each and every commitment that we've made on behalf of Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. The work is ongoing. We've made several commitments to investments towards establishing collaborative care teams, as well as some collaborative care centres, infrastructure investments to help facilitate, but also support the hiring of nurse practitioners and others to support these collaborative teams across the province, Mr. Speaker, and we'll continue towards achieving those end results. Thanks.
The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Mr. Speaker, with all due respect, my constituents can't wait 4 years. So since there are so many residents in my community that don't have a family doctor, and certainly none in the constituency, they all believe that providing frontline care should be a priority, and we're certainly asking the government what constitutes a healthcare crisis if this isn't it. The Liberals, during the election, promised us that a collaborative health centre had been approved. They said this during the Seaside FM radio debate and on the doorsteps of my constituents, who are now wondering what happened to that approval of the... So the question is, will the Minister commit to providing a collaborative health centre for our community in this year? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member's question on behalf of our constituents. Again, as I've stated before, the province continues to its efforts through the Nova Scotia Health Authority with recruitments, Mr. Speaker, of not just physicians but other frontline healthcare professionals to help improve the primary care access services that Nova Scotians not just need but deserve, Mr. Speaker. Those efforts continue. We have investments in this budget to ensure that we can achieve better results with our recruitment efforts, and we're going to continue down that path. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Education. Since we've been sitting this fall, the message from this minister and this government has been that if pre-primary was not rolled out in an ambitious way, hundreds of 4-year-olds in the province would not have the opportunity to take part in an important program. Mr. Speaker, an article was published this morning by CBC Nova Scotia, and I'll table that. It states that a daycare in Sheboygan, in the Yarmouth area, was forced to close its doors. This is only one of many childcare facilities, Mr. Speaker, that were forced to make tough decisions. My question for the minister is this: will he admit that the rushed rollout of pre-primary is being implemented at the expense of his own constituents? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education and Early Childhood.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I believe our ambitious agenda for pre-primary has been to the benefit of constituents in my area and constituents in every single area across the province that have benefited from these programs. In this particular area, Mr. Speaker, there's actually no pre-primary site in that catchment area, and in the Tri-County School Boards, they are not taking in out-of-catchment children. Also in this catchment area as well, there was another daycare provider who said that she had an overabundance of children that she wasn't able to accommodate. So I reached out directly to my constituent to discuss this issue, to better understand what the impacts have been, considering the fact that there is no pre-primary in that area and other operators in that area actually have more children than they're able to take care of.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, all of this could have been avoided if a proper plan was put in place. Had the government consulted before implementation, daycares would not find themselves in this situation. How does this government plan to help the private daycares adapt to pre-primary that is now in our schools? Thank you,
Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Speaker. In fact, our government has invested year after year millions of dollars into our daycare sector. We have a vested interest in their success. To date, we have heard from 5 out of 384 providers in this province that they have experienced some level of anxiety over this. 3 that said they have staffing issues. We're working with them to help them recruit. 1 that has indicated they're worried about future enrollment, and 1 that has said their enrollment has been impacted despite the fact that there's no pre-primary in that area, Mr. Speaker. While we've been in office, and in part because of these investments, we've actually increased spaces in the daycare sector by 1,000.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Education. As we've heard many times in this House, Mr. Speaker, there are only enough childcare spaces in the province, notwithstanding the additional 1,000, for 25% of children from birth to 4 years old. We all agree it's critical to maintain and increase the number of quality, affordable childcare spaces in the province. So, Mr. Speaker, this is why I was deeply concerned this morning, as mentioned, to read about the closure of a childcare centre in the minister's hometown of Yarmouth. Mr. Speaker, will the minister please explain what immediate steps this government is taking to make sure that the implementation of pre-primary is not coming at the cost of our already scarce childcare spaces?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I've reached out personally to my constituent to better understand the reasons for this decision. I've not been able to connect with her yet, but I know that she has experienced decreasing enrollment before pre-primary. I know that there is another operator in that same area that has more children than she is able to handle. And I'd also mention that there is no pre-primary site in this location, and in the Tri-Counties they're not taking out of catchment children. So I need to better understand the factors that are contributing to this situation. There is a natural ebb and flow in this sector. I think on average we do lose about 18 daycare providers a year, but in total, there's been a net gain of 1,000 spaces in this province because of the continued investment year after year by this government.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, in budget estimates, the minister has repeatedly reassured me that there was information collected and analyzed to determine where the initial pre-primary sites were to be located. He's told me these sites were in areas where there were no childcare spaces available, and that the logical assumption was that the children in pre-primary were not children who were being removed from existing centres. Notwithstanding the fact that the minister has repeatedly said that he's only heard from a few childcare providers, yesterday it was 3, today it was 5, What we have seen and heard so far suggests otherwise. Mr. Speaker, will the minister commit to tabling the data collected and analysis conducted by his department that was used to determine that these sites would not negatively affect existing childcare spaces, particularly those for children not eligible for pre-primary?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There are two barriers to accessing childcare and pre-primary learning in this province: geographic location, physical spaces across our province, and financial costs, Mr. Speaker. We are moving forward with a free universal program to improve that access, so not 1 in 4 children can access these programs, but 100% of our kids can access these programs, Mr. Speaker. And we need to do this. We need to do this in tandem with the childcare sector, Mr. Speaker, because both pre-primary and childcare are needed to have a robust system of support for our youth and our families, Mr. Speaker. That's why we invest year after year, unlike the NDP, who actually cut funding to daycares in this province. We've invested every single year and are continue to do that.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, a question for the Minister of Energy. One would think the purpose of any measure, be it a carbon tax, a cap-and-trade system, is to reduce consumption, to reduce emissions. The end user, the consumer, must be penalized for their consumption, so they will use less heating oil, electricity, gasoline. My question to the Minister: what Nova Scotian energy companies who provide these goods to Nova Scotians will be hurt, will be penalized by the proposed cap-and-trade system?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for the question. As we discussed in budget estimates, there'll be a number of companies that will be part of this system. So it's certainly early days, and we don't have any specifics on that particular list and a fulsome roster of what companies will be in that conversation. But the good news, Mr. Speaker, for us as Nova Scotians, as a province, we've done so much incredible work. We're so far ahead of the curve with respect to reducing GHG emissions, with respect to protecting the environment, with respect to adding renewables through our renewable retail, and all the work we've done to add renewable sources to the grid. So, Mr. Speaker, we'll have a system in place that gives a number of free credits to our users of energy, our heavy users for industry, so that at the end of the day we'll be in a much better place than many other provinces in the Federation. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, you know, the minister is correct about Nova Scotians have paid more for their energy the last number of years. Power rates went up because of these renewable sources of energy. Mr. Speaker, I think about things like LED lights, heat pumps. I think about people shopping locally for locally made goods. Those are real, good, common sense means that have improved, reduced our emissions and improved our state of our environment. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm surprised that the government is bringing forward something so important as this system without having economic analysis. Another question I'd asked in estimates was who will benefit from the trading of emissions allowances, and by extension, who will lose? Because if somebody wins, somebody loses. Mr. Speaker, how can the government put forward something as significant as a cap-and-trade system when there is no economic analysis, no claims it won't hurt anyone, but also claims people will have a reason to reduce their consumption?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, we're playing our part as part of the national efforts, and quite frankly, as part of the global efforts to protect the environment, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and make sure that we're transforming over a number of years to a renewable energy grid, and that we're doing our part. Again, Mr. Speaker, we can be very proud. All members of this House can be very proud of the work that Nova Scotians have done. The fact remains that we're... Thank you. The fact remains that we're leaders in Canada, we're leaders in the continent with respect to production in these areas. As the Premier said, certainly our government supports. We're always willing to do more, and we're going to work with our industry here in the province to do more. Because we're in such a good position, Mr. Speaker, we can allow this cap-and-trade system to come in and make sure that those who continue to be efficient, those who continue to protect the environment, will not be harmed by the cap-and-trade program. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, through you to the Minister of Environment. I'd like to ask a question today. A few weeks ago, the Eco Connects Nova Scotia meeting was held up in Truro, and it was raised by some representatives there of the Nova Scotia Environmental Network that there's currently more than $375,000 in a public environmental trust which is being held by the Department of Environment. money usually typically goes to these frontline environmental stewards in order for them to help towards their goals, making Nova Scotia a healthier, better place for us to live. It also helps them to leverage funding from other levels. My question is, are you aware that these requests have been made for the funds? And if so, why is it that the department's refusing to release them? Do you know?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question from the member opposite. There is a fund with approximately that value. There are some challenges legally on how we access that funding, so we're looking at that. It's under review. There are a number of options on the table that we're going to look at. So the option that will go forward will be the one that protects the environment the most. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Sackville-Beaverbank.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister for that. The time is ticking and opportunities are passing for this group. Like I said, they do utilize this fund and these monies to access other levels of various different levels of funding. What I'm wondering is whether or not there might be an opportunity for you to sit down with some representatives of the group. What I've been told is that staff are telling them that it costs almost what's in the account to administer the program. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. So I'm wondering if there might be an opportunity for them to meet with you.
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you've highlighted one of the challenges. There are a number of them when the fund was set up and how you access that fund. But certainly I would be willing to meet with groups. I've met with many of the NGOs in terms of the Ecology Action Centre, Clean Foundation. There's a number of important environmental groups that do great work. So I can speak with the member opposite in the future and we can coordinate a meeting. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. The palliative care program has grown considerably in the last couple of decades. The doctors and nurses are absolutely amazing at dealing with people who are actively dying and their families. Many want to die at home, and a number of families are good at doing that. I found out a couple of weeks ago that there are pockets in the province that this program cannot reach. I'm going to ask the Minister if he is aware of these pockets.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member raising this very important topic in the Legislature today. Certainly, end-of-life care delivered through our palliative and or hospice environments is an evolving and emerging process and service. There's certainly a lot of interest being expressed from communities across the province, and that's why my predecessor, the Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage, has worked a couple of years ago to develop a framework around developing and bringing forward a hospice program in communities in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've worked with the palliative care team out of Truro for many years, and I know how important this program is to families who have loved ones actively dying. I realize that money's tight and doctors are at a premium. The pockets could be filled by qualified nurses if they're attached to a palliative care doctor. It is less costly to keep people out of hospital than it is to keep them in hospital during this very crucial time. Will the Minister meet with the palliative care coordinator to address the pockets that are not being served at this time?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to assure the member that efforts, as I've mentioned, through the development and establishment of a hospice framework to support people who may not be in a position to go through the end-of-life process at home, but also so they don't necessarily have to go through it in a hospital space as well. But again, recognizing palliative services in some cases is appropriate and necessary. We work with our partners with like EMC, the paramedics that do provide services like that as well to support people that are going through this process. So, and as far as meeting, Mr. Speaker, any group or organizations looking to reach out to the department to have further discussions is welcome to do so.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday I asked the Minister of Community Services about her department's failure to address the crisis of poverty in this province. Since 2013, since this government took office, we have 7,500 more people in the province using food banks. That's a 20% increase. The Executive Director of Feed Nova Scotia told us that we have 44,000 people using food banks in this province as a last resort to address their food insecurity. Mr. Speaker, will the minister admit that the policies of her government have forced more people to turn to food banks?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member, and in fact the numbers that were provided to us from the food bank count are significantly different. But that aside, I would like to note that, for example, this year we have money for people in a tax cut, Mr. Speaker, the largest tax cut that this province has ever seen. We're instituting a breakfast program right across the province so that students, when they go to school, are not hungry, Mr. Speaker, so they can actually learn, Mr. Speaker. We are instituting a pre-primary program, Mr. Speaker, which has incredible outcomes for young people. Not only do they improve in school, they have better educational outcomes, better health outcomes, Mr. Speaker, better economic outcomes, Mr. Speaker. They're less likely to come into contact with the criminal justice system. So yes, I'm proud of what we've done.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, while this government has been spending millions on their elusive transformation, families in Nova Scotia are going hungry, and a tax credit that amounts to $13 a month won't help that very much. Between 2015 and 2016, Nova Scotia had the largest increase in food bank use of any province in this country. That same year, this government cut funding to Feed Nova Scotia by 50%. In his recent letter to the editor, the Executive Director, Nick Jennery, described this situation as a crisis that desperately needs political leadership. With all due respect, people can't stock their cupboards with this government's 4 years of reports. So, Mr. Speaker, when will the minister stop talking about plans and take action on hunger in this province?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are taking action. What the honourable member has done, what her party has done in the past is nibble around the edges, Mr. Speaker. What we are talking about is transformational change, Mr. Speaker. For far too long, people who rely on income assistance have not been able to participate in their communities, Mr. Speaker. They have not been able, Mr. Speaker, to know how much money they're going to get. They have lived precarious lives, Mr. Speaker. Transformation is going to take time, Mr. Speaker, but we're going to do it right. We're going to do it right.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Mr. Speaker, this question is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, day after day, people share their frustrations with our healthcare system. And I would suggest a major cause of the problems in our healthcare is due to ineffective management. An example, Mr. Speaker, is recently a 30-year-old veteran employee of a local hospital in Cumberland retired, and he was asked to stay on as a casual employee, so he said yes. He had to apply for the job, he had to prove immunization, he had to get a criminal record check, and then he had to do a full day of orientation in the hospital that he just worked at for 30 years. Mr. Speaker, I'm asking the minister, will he make a commitment to examine how the Department of Health is monitoring performance and make changes to make improvements?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and of course, as with other departments, as well as the Department of Health, as well as other departments, we do continue to endeavour to improve our processes and improve how operations are conducted. In this case, Mr. Speaker, I think the member's referring to the operations within the Nova Scotia Health Authority, and again, indeed, we would expect that the organisations operating on behalf of the people of Nova Scotia also look at opportunities for continuously improving the efficiency and the effectiveness of those operations. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his answer. I did forget to add, he also had to provide 3 reference checks for the job. So there does seem to be a consistent problem with hiring practices through the Nova Scotia Health Authority. For example, the president of Nova Scotia Nurses Union, Janet Hazelton, has told me it takes 78 days to hire a nurse in this province. And this is leading to an exorbitant amount of overtime and costing the healthcare system an unnecessary amount of money and a waste of funds. The question, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Health is, will he make an inquiry into the current hiring practices through the Nova Scotia Health Authority?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member's question. Indeed, efforts have been made. I know in my conversation with Ms. Hazelton earlier this summer, she too raised that concern. It's my understanding that there have been changes made in the specific case of the process for hiring nurses, and that there have been improvements even since then, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to seeing, again, continued improvements. And again, part of that process includes having dialogues with our partners like Ms. Hazelton on behalf of nurses and the Nurses Union, learning from their experiences and their concerns, and implementing changes to improve the process efficiency. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, another question for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, we know the demand to get into nursing homes is high, and the clients that are getting admitted to the nursing homes have a high need of care. Over the past number of years, the ratio of clients needing this higher level of care has increased. Mr. Speaker, much of this load is being felt by continuing care assistants. The pool of workers is not big enough, especially in rural areas. Overtime is not allowed in an attempt to save money. This has led nursing homes operating short of staff, making it difficult for those who are working and also difficult for their clients. Are the Minister's audits of nursing homes picking this up?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I assure the member opposite that there are ongoing reviews and assessments, that is inspections of our care facilities across the province being conducted by representatives of the province to complete that work. When those assessments are complete, Mr. Speaker, there are follow-up actions with the administrators of the facilities to ensure that a plan is put in place and that actions are taken to ensure that any deficiencies identified are addressed on a go-forward basis. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, that is certainly what should be happening, but my fear is that's not what is happening. What I'm worried about is who is going to fix it. For-profit home operators don't have motivation to fix this problem, except maybe if a lawsuit were to happen. We know that registered nurses are putting their licenses on the line, working in these conditions with this kind of risk. Some CCAs have actually chosen to quit and to change careers. Is this something the Minister wants to fix? And I'm sure he does. But we need a plan to fix it, Mr. Speaker. And we need some action on this. We need some results. And perhaps maybe the Minister could report some progress on this activity.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member's question. Of course, the member may recall that through the election campaign process, some priorities that, and if he reviews my mandate, Mr. Speaker, if you're really to break down priority areas for my role here is primary care, which we talk a lot about here, mental health, and indeed continuing care, which this would fall under, Mr. Speaker. So, of course, it is a priority of the government, a priority of my mandate and my role is to continue to work to improve our continuing care. I have staff dedicated working towards the continuing care strategy improvements, Mr. Speaker, to improve the system, not just in the short term, but over the long term as well.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in an attempt to follow your new mandate of more hugs and less slugs, I wish to ask my favourite Minister of Community Services a couple of questions. Recently, my office received a request from a constituent who must travel to Halifax for medical care and is presently receiving income assistance from DCS. He has recently been prescribed medical marijuana by a specialist in Halifax. This individual suffers from many conditions. 2 of his recent appointments in Halifax were connected with regulating his marijuana. DCS would not cover his related expenses because he was attending the marijuana clinic to do this regulation. My question is, why is DCS not providing coverage for this particular individual?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the Honourable Member and assure him he is one of my favourite members on the opposite side as well. I'm not familiar with this particular case. I would note that under the NDP government, coverage for medical marijuana was discontinued from the formulary for income assistance clients, but I would have to look into the particular case for him, which I'm more than happy to do because we don't speak publicly about individual cases. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my constituent's physician is somewhat upset that his patient is being placed in a position where he cannot afford to follow his medical advice. With the legalization of recreational marijuana occurring next year, why are these stumbling blocks being put in the way of assistance for this individual? I certainly understand that caseworkers with DCS have to operate within the parameters as set out by DHW. My question is, why are they questioning, interfering, or not allowing my constituent to receive the prescribed orders of a board-certified physician?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
And I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I'll be happy to look into it for him. Thank you.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Internal Services. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia deserves to know exactly who stands to benefit from contracts for huge infrastructure projects. Yesterday, we heard from the Premier that his government wasn't being lobbied by anyone. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister agree to table a list of lobbyists and their respective clients that have been in contact with the government in regards to major infrastructure projects in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for the question. Our procurement process is a national process that is done by all levels of government, and those are all matters of public record, all matters subject to FOIPOP, and our office is constantly willing and ready to help any proponent who's looking for that information to follow the procedures that are in place.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
So since I'm asking, I don't know if that means she's going to provide the information to me. So I look forward to that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we've heard continually from the government that when it comes to the QE2 redevelopment project, for example, they're keeping all options on the table. And I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure if this is the case, plenty of research will have been done already in advance of groundbreaking on this crucial piece of infrastructure. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal if he would agree to release all records of the comparison his department has done and has made between a traditional public build and a P3 option for the QE2 redevelopment.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question. We're in preliminary stage of developing the many options, and we are so pleased as a government to be in charge of this milestone activity that we're talking about in this great leap forward for healthcare in Nova Scotia by replacing these aged facilities. And you can rest assured, Mr. Speaker, that this government will provide the best path forward based on value for money for all Nova Scotians to figure out just exactly how we're going to replace these facilities. Thank you.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, since announcing the purchase of 37 P3 schools over the last year, this government has been short on details on how this process will take place. P3 schools are currently maintained and operated by the owner for the students and staff, and the technology of some of these schools is much different than the older schools operated by the school board. My question for the Minister is this: can the Minister please explain what process his department has undertaken to ensure that the schools they are purchasing are going to be maintained and continue to be operated in a manner similar to how they are currently?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In terms of the process of purchasing, we took the lead from the school boards. They identified, as per the contracts for the P3s, whether they wanted to give the asset back to the company or purchase it for needs in their community. The vast majority did want to purchase those schools because it was deemed to be necessary for the student population in those areas. We have budgeted in our department funding for technological upgrades and maintenance, so that is embedded in our budget, and that is per the contract that we have with P3 schools.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, last weekend we were told that one school, a complete air handling system will be too expensive to be operated once the school board takes control of the building. And some schools have security and maintenance personnel who do a whole host of duties that have changed the way the school operates. Can the minister please reassure staff and students of these 37 schools that life will not be negatively affected when the school board takes over their operations?
Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Of course, health and safety and quality of our buildings are top of mind always. I'm not familiar with these specific concerns, but if the board does want to reach out to our department to discuss potential issues, we're of course happy to have those conversations.
Order, please.
With.
Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. The honourable member for Yarmouth on a point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I heard distinctly in question period the member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River suggest that it was a lie when I said that the NDP had cut funding to daycares in the province. I would just ask that member to refer to the budgets that were actually tabled by previous finance ministers of the NDP.
Order, please. It's not a point of order. That's a disagreement of facts. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.